I used to think I was good at keeping secrets. In my line of work, marketing for tech startups, confidentiality was everything. Client strategies, product launches, sensitive financial information. I'd built my reputation on being someone who could be trusted with the details that mattered. I prided myself on my discretion, on being the person colleagues came to when they needed to vent about something they couldn't say to anyone else. But there's a difference between keeping professional secrets and protecting the people you love. A difference I didn't understand until it was too late. The thing about betrayal is that it rarely happens all at once. It's not usually a single moment of conscious cruelty, but rather a series of small compromises, tiny erosions of trust that accumulate over time until suddenly you're standing in the wreckage of something you helped destroy. You tell yourself it's harmless, just a funny story, just sharing with friends, just making conversation. You tell yourself you're not really betraying anyone because you're not being malicious, because you still love them, because surely they'd understand if they knew. The worst part wasn't that I betrayed Chris's trust, though I did, completely and inexcusably. The worst part was that I didn't even realize I was doing it until it was too late. Standing in the middle of our marketing firm's holiday party, watching him walk away from me for what would turn out to be the last time, I finally understood what I'd been doing to him all along. But let me back up, because this story really starts 4 years earlier, when I was 31 and convinced I had dating figured out. I met Chris at a mutual friend's barbecue in July 2019. He was sitting alone on the deck, reading a paperback novel while everyone else was clustered around the grill or playing cornhole in the yard. Something about that image, this tall, lanky guy with sandy hair, completely absorbed in his book while a party swirled around him, made me curious. "Good book?" I asked, settling into the chair next to him. He looked up, startled, then smiled. "Oh, hey, yeah, it's this mystery series I'm obsessed with. Probably not the most social thing to do at a party." "I don't know, I think it's kind of perfect. Shows you're not desperately trying to impress anyone." "Is that what I'm showing?" He laughed, and I noticed he had this way of tilting his head when he was amused, like he was genuinely delighted by whatever you'd said. We talked for 2 hours. He was a software developer, worked remotely for a company in Denver, had moved to Austin the year before because he'd always wanted to live somewhere with actual seasons. He asked thoughtful questions and listened to my answers like they mattered. When I told him about my job at Richardson and Associates, handling marketing campaigns for tech startups, he didn't immediately launch into his own work stories the way most guys did. "That sounds like it requires a lot of psychological insight," he said. "Figuring out what makes people want things they didn't know they wanted." I was smitten. We started dating slowly, carefully. Chris wasn't the type to rush into anything, and I appreciated that about him. He'd text me thoughtful messages throughout the day, little observations about things he'd seen or read. He remembered details about my life that I'd forgotten I'd shared. When we finally slept together, 6 weeks in, it was gentle and attentive in a way that made me feel genuinely seen. The thing about Chris was that he was quietly, consistently thoughtful. He noticed when I was stressed about a client presentation and would show up at my apartment with Thai food and offer to help me practice. He remembered that I hated grocery shopping and would pick up items I'd mentioned needing. He never made a big deal about these gestures. They just seemed natural to him. Looking back, I think this is where my problems started. Not because Chris was thoughtful, but because I began to take his thoughtfulness as a given rather than a gift. It became background noise in my life, something I expected rather than appreciated. By our first anniversary, we'd settled into a comfortable rhythm. Chris worked from his home office. I went to the Richardson and Associates offices downtown. We'd cook dinner together most nights, watch Netflix, talk about our days. On weekends, we'd explore Austin, hiking trails, farmers markets, new restaurants. It was pleasant and stable, and I thought that was what I wanted. But there were things about Chris that I found myself cataloging as quirks, then annoyances, then sources of mild embarrassment. He was genuinely enthusiastic about things I considered mundane: bird watching, historical documentaries, obscure science fiction novels. He had strong opinions about coffee brewing methods and would spend 20 minutes each morning with his elaborate pour-over setup. He collected vintage postcards, not for any particular reason, just because he liked them. And then there was the thing that would eventually become the center of this story. I discovered Chris's interest in vintage lingerie about 8 months into our relationship. I was looking for a phone charger in his bedroom and opened what I thought was a random drawer. Instead, I found a collection of photographs, not pornographic, but artistic black and white images of women in 1940s and 1950s undergarments. Elegant, sculptural pieces that looked more like architectural studies than anything explicitly sexual. When I asked him about it, Chris got flustered in a way I'd never seen before. "It's just I don't know how to explain it," he said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I've always been fascinated by the craftsmanship of vintage lingerie, the way it was constructed, the attention to detail. It's like wearable art." He explained that he'd been collecting these photographs for years, that he found them at estate sales and antique shops. He also had a small collection of actual vintage pieces, not to wear but to study the construction techniques. "I know it sounds weird," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I've never told anyone about this before." The vulnerability in his voice should have made me tender toward him. Instead, I felt a strange mix of fascination and discomfort. It wasn't that I thought there was anything wrong with his interest. It was clearly artistic and thoughtful, very much in character for Chris. But something about the secrecy, the way he'd hidden this part of himself, made me feel like I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to know. "It's not weird," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "It's just different." I wish I could say that conversation brought us closer together, that I embraced this new understanding of who Chris was. But instead, I found myself filing it away as another one of his quirks, another thing that made him slightly odd in a way that I'd have to explain to other people. This, I now realize, was the beginning of my betrayal. The first time I mentioned Chris's collection to someone else was about a month later. I was having lunch with my sister Emma, and she was complaining about her boyfriend's obsession with fantasy sports. "At least your guy seems normal," she said, and without thinking I replied, "Well, he does collect vintage lingerie photographs." I said it lightly, almost dismissively, as if it were just another random fact about him, like his preference for dark roast coffee or his habit of reading before bed. Emma's eyebrows shot up. "Wait, what, like actual lingerie?" "Photos mostly," I said, already regretting bringing it up. "And some actual pieces. He's into the craftsmanship or whatever." I could hear myself minimizing it, turning something that clearly meant a lot to Chris into a casual aside. "That's interesting," Emma said, in the tone people use when they're trying to be polite about something they find strange. "Does he want you to wear vintage stuff?" "No, it's not like that," I said quickly. "It's more academic, historical interest." But even as I said it, I could feel myself distancing from him, treating his passion like something I had to defend rather than something I could admire. That lunch conversation haunted me for weeks. Not because I regretted telling Emma, she was my sister, after all, but because of how I'd told her. I'd presented Chris's interest as something mildly embarrassing rather than something beautiful, something that required explanation rather than celebration. I'd made him sound like a quirky character in my life rather than the person I loved. The pattern continued over the months that followed. At a work happy hour, when colleagues were sharing funny stories about their partners, I found myself contributing a tale about Chris's elaborate weekend routine for organizing his vintage postcard collection. At a dinner party, when someone mentioned their husband's unusual hobby, I chimed in with details about Chris's precise method for documenting the historical provenance of his lingerie photographs. Each time I told these stories as if they were charming anecdotes, but I could feel myself creating distance between Chris and the listener, presenting him as an amusing eccentric rather than someone whose interests had depth and meaning. What made it worse was that Chris had no idea I was doing this. He continued to share his discoveries with me, showing me a particularly beautiful photograph he'd found at an estate sale, or explaining the historical significance of a certain type of corset construction. He trusted me with his enthusiasm, and I was systematically betraying that trust in conversations he'd never hear. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. At home, I'd listen to Chris explain the difference between 1940s and 1950s brassiere construction techniques, with genuine interest. He was knowledgeable and passionate, and there was something attractive about his expertise. But then I'd go to work the next day and find myself describing the same conversation to Janet as if it were evidence of his oddness rather than his intelligence. I started to notice other ways I was doing this too. When Chris would get excited about a new bird species he'd spotted on our weekend hikes, I'd later describe his enthusiasm to friends as adorable in a way that felt patronizing. When he'd spend an evening researching the optimal brewing temperature for a new type of tea he'd discovered, I'd turn it into a story about his obsessiveness rather than his curiosity. I was taking all the things that made him interesting and thoughtful and repackaging them as quirks for other people's entertainment. The worst part was that I think I was doing it to make myself seem more interesting by association. Having a boyfriend with unusual hobbies made me feel like I was someone who attracted complex, artistic people. But instead of letting that complexity speak for itself, I was curating it, presenting only the aspects that made for good stories while ignoring the depth and genuine passion behind his interests. Chris never asked me to stop, never even knew I was doing it. He continued to trust me with his inner world, sharing his latest discoveries and research. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with such open affection when he was explaining something he'd learned, and I'd feel a stab of guilt knowing that I'd been turning his vulnerability into entertainment for others. The irony wasn't lost on me that I worked in marketing, where understanding authentic consumer desires was crucial, yet I was completely failing to understand or authentically represent the person I lived with. I was reducing Chris to a series of marketable quirks instead of seeing him as a complete human being with complex interests and genuine expertise. Over the next 2 years, as our relationship deepened and we moved in together, I never brought up the lingerie collection again. Chris never mentioned it either, though I occasionally noticed him looking at auction websites or browsing through vintage shops when we'd travel. I didn't discourage him, but I didn't show interest either. I treated it like something that existed in a separate compartment of his life, unrelated to our shared reality. Meanwhile, I was building another version of Chris in my conversations with other people. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but gradually, story by story, I began presenting him as a collection of amusing eccentricities rather than a complete person. At work, during coffee breaks with my colleagues, I'd share Chris stories. How he'd spent an entire weekend researching the optimal water temperature for brewing different types of tea. How he'd gotten genuinely excited about finding a 1962 postcard from Yellowstone. How he'd stayed up until 3 a.m. reading online forums about vintage camera equipment. "Your boyfriend sounds like such a character," my colleague Janet would say, and I'd laugh and agree. "He's definitely unique." I thought I was being affectionate. I thought I was sharing cute anecdotes about the person I loved. But what I was actually doing was turning Chris into entertainment for my coworkers, reducing him to a series of quirky behaviors that made good stories at lunch. And then came the company holiday party. Richardson and Associates always threw an elaborate December celebration. Open bar, catered dinner, speeches from the partners, dancing until midnight. Partners' spouses were invited, and Chris had been to a few of these events with me over the years. He was polite and charming, if a bit reserved, and my colleagues seemed to like him. The 2022 party was held at a hotel downtown, and Chris had bought a new suit for the occasion. He looked handsome and confident, and I felt proud walking in with him. We mingled during the cocktail hour, and he did his usual thing of finding 1 or 2 people to have genuine conversations with while I worked the room. After dinner, I found myself at the bar with Janet and 2 other colleagues, Kelly and Priya. We were several drinks in, and the conversation had turned to relationships and the funny things our partners did. Kelly was telling us about her husband's obsession with fantasy football, and Priya was describing her girlfriend's elaborate skincare routine. "Oh, you want to hear something weird?" I said, leaning in conspiratorially. "Chris has this thing about vintage lingerie." I can still remember the words leaving my mouth, the way my colleagues' faces lit up with interest. I can remember the feeling of being the center of attention, of having something juicy to contribute to the conversation. "Like he wears it?" Janet asked, eyes wide. No, I laughed. He collects it, like photographs and actual pieces. He's super into the craftsmanship and construction. He's got this whole collection hidden away. That's actually kind of cool, Priya said. Like, from an artistic perspective. Right, but also like, what do you do with that information? I continued. I mean, I love the guy, but sometimes I feel like I'm dating a museum curator who specializes in women's underwear. They laughed, and I felt that familiar rush of being entertaining, of having successfully transformed one of Chris's private interests into a story that made people respond. I was about to elaborate when I noticed Kelly's expression change, her eyes focusing on something behind me. I turned around, and there was Chris, standing about 10 feet away, holding 2 glasses of wine. His face was completely blank, but I could see something crumbling behind his eyes. The conversation around me continued for a few more seconds before my colleagues realized what was happening. Kelly touched my arm gently. Maybe we should. But Chris was already walking away, setting the wine glasses down on a nearby table and heading for the exit. I excused myself and followed him, my heart pounding. I caught up with him in the hotel lobby. He was standing near the elevators, staring at the floor indicators. Chris, wait. I came over to bring you wine, he said quietly, still not looking at me. I thought you might want to dance later. I can explain. You called my collection weird. You said I was like a museum curator who specializes in women's underwear. He finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before, not anger, but profound disappointment. You made me into a joke for your coworkers. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. He pressed the elevator button. That's exactly what you meant, and the worst part is I don't think you even realize you've been doing it. Doing what? Turning me into stories, turning the things I care about into entertainment. The elevator arrived with a soft ding. I've heard you, Briar, at parties on phone calls with your friends. You talk about me like I'm this amusing character in your life instead of a person you're supposed to love. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but something about the way he said it made me realize he was right. I had been doing exactly that. I'm going home, he said, stepping into the elevator. You can get a ride with your coworkers. I'm sure they'll have plenty to say about this. The elevator doors closed, and I stood there in the lobby, still wearing my party dress, feeling like I'd just watched something important disappear forever. I took an Uber home an hour later, after making awkward excuses to my colleagues and enduring Kelly's sympathetic but awkward attempts to comfort me. Chris's car was gone when I arrived, and he didn't come home that night. He showed up the next afternoon to pack a bag, and we had the conversation I'd been dreading. I think I need some space, he said, folding shirts into a suitcase. I need to figure out if this is something we can work through. Of course we can work through it, I said. I made a mistake, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know you didn't mean to, he said, but that almost makes it worse. The fact that you've been turning me into entertainment for other people without even realizing it. It wasn't entertainment. I was just sharing stories. People do that about their partners. Do they? He stopped packing and looked at me. Because when I talk about you to my friends, I tell them about how brilliant you are at your job, how you make me laugh, how you sing along to the radio when you think no one's listening. I don't tell them about your flaws or the things you're insecure about. I don't turn your private interests into amusing anecdotes. I had no response to that, because he was absolutely right. I told you about the lingerie collection because I trusted you, he continued. It was something I'd never shared with anyone else, and you turned it into a story about your weird boyfriend and his unusual hobby. I didn't call you weird. You did, just now to your coworkers. But even before that, you've been presenting me as this eccentric character instead of as someone you respect and admire. He finished packing and stood by the door. I'm going to stay at my friend Marcus's place for a while. I need to think about whether I can be in a relationship with someone who sees me as a collection of quirks rather than as a person. That was 4 months ago. We've talked a few times since then, careful conversations about practical matters, mail, shared subscriptions, a few belongings he needed to retrieve. But we haven't talked about us, about whether there's a path forward. I keep thinking about what he said about how he talks about me to his friends. I've started paying attention to how I talk about the people I care about, and I've realized that Chris was right. I do turn people into stories. I do reduce them to their most entertaining characteristics. I think I do it because it makes me feel clever and observant, like I'm someone who notices interesting details about the world. But what Chris helped me understand is that there's a difference between appreciating someone's uniqueness and treating them like a curiosity. The thing about Chris's lingerie collection wasn't that it was weird, it was that it was beautiful. He saw artistry and craftsmanship in something that most people would dismiss or sexualize. He had developed expertise in something obscure and specialized, the way other people become experts in wine or antique furniture. It was actually one of the most attractive things about him, this capacity for deep appreciation. But I never learned to see it that way. I never asked him to show me what he found beautiful in those photographs, never tried to understand the historical context or the artistic elements that fascinated him. I just filed it away as another Chris quirk, another story to tell. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, about the difference between knowing someone and understanding them. I knew Chris collected vintage lingerie photographs. I knew he was enthusiastic about obscure topics. I knew he had strong opinions about coffee brewing. But I never really understood what these things meant to him, never tried to see them through his eyes. And because I never tried to understand, I never learned to appreciate. And because I never learned to appreciate, I turned the things that made him special into sources of mild embarrassment. I miss him. I miss the way he'd get excited about small discoveries, the way he'd remember details about my day that I'd forgotten myself. I miss his thoughtfulness, his gentle humor, his genuine interest in the world around him. I miss being loved by someone who saw me as more than the sum of my entertaining characteristics. But mostly, I miss the person I could have been if I'd learned to love him the way he deserved to be loved, with curiosity instead of judgment, with appreciation instead of amusement. Last week, I walked past an antique shop downtown and saw a display of vintage clothing in the window. There was a 1950s slip among the items, pale blue silk with intricate lace trim. I stood there for a long time, trying to see it the way Chris would have, as a piece of craftsmanship, as a small work of art created by someone who cared about beauty and detail. I almost texted him about it, but I didn't. I don't think I've earned the right to share his interests yet. Maybe someday, if I can learn to see people as more than stories to tell, if I can develop the capacity to appreciate rather than just observe. For now, I'm trying to practice understanding instead of cataloging, trying to love the people in my life for who they are rather than for how they make me look. It's harder than I thought it would be, breaking the habit of turning life into entertainment. But I'm working on it. I owe Chris that much, even if he never comes back. I owe it to myself and to anyone else I might love someday to learn the difference between knowing someone and truly seeing them. The vintage slip was still in the window when I walked past again yesterday. Still beautiful, still carefully crafted, still worthy of appreciation rather than amusement. I'm starting to understand what Chris saw in things like that, not weirdness, but wonder. Not something to laugh about, but something to cherish. I just wish I'd learned to see it while I still had the chance to share that vision with him.